Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as part of the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival 2024. Welcome. Please take a moment to read our anti-harassment policy that is dropped in the chat box. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival's YouTube channel. And if you are a classroom, school librarian, or an educator joining us, please keep in mind that our school visit fund is back, and you can enter to win a free visit from a Latinx author or illustrator, along with potentially a set of books for your classroom or library. You can find the link to enter in the chat or on our website. I am Ismay Williams. I'm one of the co-founders of the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. I am so thrilled to be here with these amazing authors. We're going to introduce ourselves, and I said I would go first because I'm already talking. So I am a published young adult and picture book writer. So my first young adult novel came out in 2017, Water in May. My second one came out in 2020, right before the pandemic. It was very not exciting. And then I had an anthology. I edited this anthology with Rebecca Valcarcel called Boundless, which is about the multicultural, multi-ethnic experience. And basically, everyone else in this book is way more famous than I am. So check it out. And I just had my very first picture book come out in May. Um, and so that's why we're all here, because we all have experience writing across different age ranges and different audiences. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But I'm going to pass the baton to Monica Brown, who's going to introduce herself. Monica?
Thank you so much, Ismay. I'm so honored to be with these amazing writers today. When I was contemplating my career, because I have written across genres, I thought about my first picture book I ever published with Rafael Lopez. It was both of our first books. My name is Celia, me llamo Celia, and it was 2004. So I have been writing children's books and for young people for over 2 decades, which I can hardly believe. You might know me for some of my fictional picture books like Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match and Waiting for the Biblioburo, Esperando al Biblioburo. But I also have written several series, and I'm happy to answer questions about those today. My first series I ever wrote was the Lola Levine series about a little girl who is Peruana and Hungarian Jewish and the daughter of an immigrant, a Peruvian immigrant like me, who was raised Catholic, but who has a mixed racial, multi-ethnic, religious heritage. And so that was my first chapter book series. I've also written about Sarai or Sarai. She goes by Sarai Gonzalez in the Sarai in the meaning of awesome series. And for the Chelsea Clinton, She Persisted. So that's a different type of audience, nonfiction chapter books, several books. And in fact, my 2 new books this last month, September, are a nonfiction picture book biography of Doña Felisa Rincon de Gautier, Puerto Rico's first female mayor, and about one of my personal heroes that I've gotten to know and stand alongside with, Dolores Huerta. So I'm really excited about that, and a new chapter book series that's coming out next summer about a mermaid princess spy who comes above water to find out why humans are polluting the oceans so much, called The Fantastical Tales of Mari A. Fish. And so lots of fun with that series. And I'm excited just to hopefully create opportunities for writers, because there's so much talent out there. So thanks for having me, everyone.
Yay. Okay, Lakin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Lakin Zaya Kemp, and I'm a Chicana author living in Austin, Texas. My desk is really messy right now because I'm on deadline. So I have a few books here, but I didn't grab all of them. A lot of you might be more familiar with my debut, which was a young adult novel, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet. It was a Pura Belpré honor recipient. But my most recent young adult novel is An Appetite for Miracles. It's also my very first novel in verse. And that one won the Jean Flynn Award for YA fiction this year. I also have a middle grade series, the Omega Morales series, So this is obviously a different age category, also different genre. This one is fantasy. And then I currently have 2 picture books out. Last year, my debut picture book came out, A Crown for Corina. And this year, the Spanish version also came out. So that one you can get in both English and Spanish. And same with my most recent picture book, Desert Song, which came out this summer. And this one was a simultaneous English and Spanish release. And then in addition to those, I've got lots of other forthcoming picture books, YA historical, upper middle grade. And then I also have an upcoming I Can Read series. So I not only write across genre and age category, but also format as well.
Amazing. Okay, Noni, your turn.
So my name is Nonica Ramos, and I am a teacher and a writer, and I write across genres as well. I'm so excited to be here because this is an opportunity to open up everyone to get experiment, which I love to do with writing, to try something different, maybe out of your comfort zone. So I'll start with the first one that put me out of my comfort zone, which Monica will know a lot about. I wrote my first nonfiction picture book bio, Best Believe, the Tres Hermanas, A Sisterhood for the Common Good, which is about 3 Boricua pioneers in the Bronx. And this book, Monica actually mentored me on because it was my first foray into nonfiction and biography, and she was helping me with craft. This started off as 2,000 words and is now a nice tight 500. So for some of my fiction, Beauty Woke is some of the work that I have. I generally write in verse. And this is basically a book about cultural pride. Some of you may know Your Mama, which is another picture book. And there, I think like Lakin and Monica, I definitely have other books in the pipeline. This one's an especial favorite, Hair Story, about beautiful hair and friendship. And I guess I will pivot to the YA. I'm dealing with both sides of the spectrum right now as far as publication. So I'm basically picture books and YA. So my debut, which I was thinking, Monica, when you were talking, I think I started in publication in 2016, 17, was the Disturbed Girls Dictionary. And I'm not going to tell you about it. I'll just show you the inside cover just to give you an idea of plot. Judge the books by their covers, everyone. And so the one that is out now is They Thought They Buried Us. And this was my first kind of foray into combining genres. This has script. This is a mystery. This is considered horror. I considered it literary horror. And this was definitely my first time writing outside of the very close first person point of view. So I think as we go forward tonight, we can talk about craft, we can talk about voice and different points of views. And I think before this started, I was also talking about how some of us have written for textbooks for children. And so that might be something that might be curious to the audience, but thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, I love that. And also thank you for mentioning that you're also an educator, because I don't think the rest of us talked about where we were before or what we still do in addition to being writers, which helps inform, I think, our writing career. So I actually, my background is as a physician. I'm a pediatric cardiologist, and my first writing was really medical writing. I wrote journal articles. It's very, very different. And I wrote grants, very, very different. But I was an avid reader all along. And Monica, you had mentioned, and I know Lakin, why don't you guys just pop in and say what your backgrounds were before fiction writing?
Well, this is what's so beautiful about a life around words. Briefly, books saved me when I had a very challenging adolescence. They were my escape. They helped me imagine my life. I went in a declared literature major in college, and my first job was as a journalist. And then I wanted to become a teacher. I taught all sorts of students, and I ended up becoming a professor and teaching US, Latino, and African American and Latina literature to young people. And then I had children and wanted to write the books, to quote the late, great Toni Morrison, that I wanted to see in the world for my own daughters and for other children. And so finding your voice changes, your audience changes, but being empowered through words is a beautiful thing. So hopefully we can do that today, a little bit today. There's so much knowledge here when I just listen to the three of you.
And I'm also a former teacher. So I taught 9th and 10th grade ESL and was a teacher for about 5 years before I made the transition to writing full time. And that was something that I did the summer of 2020. We all remember where we were. And at that time, I live in Texas. At that time, school districts were still planning on sending teachers back in person, but didn't really have any plans and protocols in place in order to keep us safe. I had just sold the first book in the Omega Morales series, and I had also just sold my first picture book, which actually is not A Crown for Corina. She came second. This other book has just been pushed and pushed for several years, and it'll come out next year. But I had sold those projects in close succession, and so that gave me sort of an exit ramp to leave teaching at this time when it was really precarious and just really scary and stressful. And we didn't know what the future looked like. So I, am really grateful that I had an escape route, essentially. And I know there are probably lots of educators watching who, especially if you're an English teacher or a librarian or an ESL teacher, writing is probably one of your strengths as well. And you're probably really curious about how you can take those skills and transfer them into a creative field like this. I know so many teachers who dream of writing a picture book someday or writing a novel someday. And I hope this conversation helps inspire some of those of you out there to give it a try.
Amazing. Exactly. Perfect. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much, Lakin. So I thought what we would do is we're going to start by discussing picture books. That's for targeting the youngest age group, and then we'll move up, and then we will sort of compare and contrast them as we go, but then we'll summarize. As we go, we will try to hit on some specific craft points that are important for each category. And then at the end, we'll take a step back and we'll look more at how does a writer manage writing for these different age groups, and with working with your agent, your editor, how do you market for different age groups? So that'll be towards the end. But as we get started, I want to just put on the table the unifying factor in all of this is that we all write for young people. We write for young minds, for children from pre-K all the way up to college range and beyond. Obviously, there are many adults that read our books as well, including parents who read our picture books for their young children. But I think when you are a writer for young people, for children, what's important to keep in mind is not just your audience, but I think, and we've all had this conversation internally amongst ourselves when we gather at conferences, there's just a little bit more almost responsibility that we feel that we carry, because your words matter, these stories matter, and you have to be really careful in how you craft and tell your story so that it's as truthful to the experience that you're trying to convey, and that it will not perpetuate any harm or be misconstrued. And so that's something that I think is a little bit different than when you write for adults. In the adult world, I think there's a little bit less I don't want to say need, but a little bit less focus or intentionality on what is the meaning of your work, and what is the purpose of your work. It's not, our work isn't just to entertain, it's to educate. And so I think we all take that responsibility very much to heart and strongly. So let's start with picture books. So picture books are unique. And I should say picture books also can have a different age range, right? You can have very young picture books. They can be board books. And then you can have picture books going all the way up, even through middle school if they're nonfiction picture books. I have to say, I was like, oh, that's a younger age range. But I even was recently in a conversation where somebody was mentioning that in their college class, they've been reading picture books, which I think is fantastic. But by and large,
I often use picture books a lot in the ESL classroom. So any ESL teachers watching will know that they're a great tool for language learners as well.
That's it. Thank you. That's perfect because of the added benefit of the illustrations. But But when most people think of picture books, they think of, bedtime stories, um, read aloud stories in the classroom or in the library. And then there's picture books that are fiction about, just made up stories. And then there's nonfiction picture books, as Noni and Monica had mentioned that they've done both, as has Lakin. I've only done fiction so far. But so, Monica, do you want to start and lead us through some of the maybe some of the differences between how you think about like a creative versus a nonfiction picture book, and just like some basic facts about picture books, like let's talk to that educator who's thinking, I want to write a picture book. Where do I start? What do I have to keep in mind?
Well, first of all, if you're an educator, that's fantastic, because I often say you do not need to be a parent to write for children. What the reason so many librarians and teachers end up writing for children is because they understand how children think and how they talk and how they learn and how not to talk down to them, right? Because their minds are very, very open, and it's really exciting. So I write both fiction and nonfiction. I think I'll take the fiction because it's really joyful. And I think children's picture books have work to do in the world. And sometimes that work is supporting educators, like writing about activists like Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, or letting them have new ways in to books that represent true stories, real heroes in their culture and in the culture of the Americas. But I also think the work they might do is just to bring some joy and levity, or she's always mentioned, because she was so brilliant, Rudine Sims Bishop, they offer children windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors. We get more compassionate when we walk in the shoes of another. And I think that's true for children too. In terms of craft, I will say the single best advice I have if you're writing a picture book is the relationship between art and text. It's where they meet. In each page, you want to write illustratable action. And so that was like the best lesson for me in terms of at the craft level. And I learned it when I wrote my first book and when I wrote another early book about a musician, because you can't just have the same image on each page, right? So if you're going to talk about Celia Cruz singing, you're going to say her voice climbs and rocks and flips and dips and feels like rolling down a hill, running under a waterfall. So as you write for children, I guess in terms of craft, I would say keep in mind the action on each and every spread. And picture books are usually 28 pages. That's 14 spreads, or they can be 32. And words are sparse. So it's like a poem or a song. In general, they're 500 to 800 words. With bilingual books, they sometimes want us to have fewer because they're going to have, as most of my books are, though some are like Lakin and are published in Spanish and English, then you have a different layout, but you need more space for bilingual books. And so spare language in the way you'd be particular in choosing like you do in a poem. So that's just a little bit. I've spent 20 years writing picture books, and I'm curious to see what two picture book authors that I think are two of like the brightest shining stars of the last few years have to say. So.
Noni, do you want to jump in and then we'll hear from Lakin?
Just making sure I'm unmuted. Yeah, so I think when you're planning your picture book, and whether you're coming at that as an educator or someone who just loves literature, picture books are stunning and they're gorgeous and they're museums. And I think that there's as much to investigate and enjoy about that as the art. If you're out there and you're an illustrator, each side tells a story and they intertwine and weave together. So the text can tell a story. Teachers know this, right? You cover up all the words and you can tell the story as you do a picture walk, right? And the text should sing to the point where they need to be read aloud. Just like poetry, educators would say to kids, this is meant to be read aloud, right? So we enjoy picture books in our mind, but they're meant to be something that echoes and that maybe the kids sing some of the parts along with you. So Monica did a beautiful job talking about, the structure. I want to talk about playing with it I'll just sort of be the disruptor. So I was thinking about Hair Story, and I was thinking about hybrid. So in this book, it's two girls. It's your typical verse, right? Very sparse. We definitely have to be economical with our language, because the language is going to be the spark, and the rest of it's going to be in what comes out of that child's mind or that reader's mind, right? So at the end of it, it talks about two girls and their hair, but then it has a historical part. So I also want to share that you can have room to play. So in here, you can see speaking of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, one of the characters is called Rudine in honor of her. There's a historical part of actual people in history who have had hair stories themselves, right? And then maybe we can talk about back matter here a little bit too. And at the end, there's a little blurb on each of those characters for teachers to use, so they don't have to look anything up. It's right there. I think one of the things we want to talk about is we understand as writers, we want to give teachers material and tools, especially when it may be difficult at this point in time to get accurate history, to get history that's representative. We have a pretty tough climate for teachers right now. And then there's also the part where you get to share your own story. So I'm sure that Monica and Lincoln have also had the experience where you get to put an author's note in there. And so this is just little pieces for you to think about when you're playing. Mentor texts, I do want to mention that. If you are excited by a book that you see here today and you're like, that book is wonderful, go ahead and take it out of your library, or even, we'd love for you to purchase it either way, and look at how the author has put their work together. I've certainly, Monica, when you talked about Sing It Like Celia, as you know, these are religious texts in my house. So take the authors that you love and go ahead and just for yourself, take it apart a little bit and worship the lines and think, well, wait, how can I do those pieces? Sometimes the picture books that you love are instructional in themselves, and it doesn't subtract from the magic. It's empowering to think, wait a minute, I see how Lincoln has constructed this. Lincoln's often mentioned, I know this, for beautiful language all the time when I see the book reviews, right? Oh, well, I love this language. How does she do it? I don't know if we'll get to the exact crux of it, but you can look into the book for that. And I guess I also just kind of want to talk about the ability to think about who you're writing for, but how they're going to read it. So this is what I'll leave you with. Are you expecting the kid to read it on their own? Right? There are books like that where littles who can't read, they're emerging, right? They can turn pages enough on their own and become a reader from the very fact that they can pick out words. There are other books where you write, you're like, I want this child to be in someone's lap when they read this. I want their caregiver. I tend to do that because I tend to write my picture books for the caregiver as much as the child at this point with books that have come out. Or are you thinking, well, I picture this in a classroom. Like I do picture this in a classroom. What would that look like if the teacher's reading it? So I do think you can think a little bit about, well, how is this going to be read? Is it going to be a big time read along at the library, or not so much? It's a little dense. It's going to be something in a classroom like you might have with a picture book bios sometimes. So just some questions and thoughts for you to consider as you play, because I hope everyone here tonight is we're all for the craft and for the nitty gritty, but there also has to be the element of play in it.
I love that. Thank you so much. And it's true, something even no matter what you're doing, if you're writing, you have to know your audience, right? Whether you're a journalist, whether you're writing for a medical journal, or you're writing a picture book, you really need to understand your audience and the audience's expectations. So that is excellent advice, Noni. Lakin, what pearls do you have to add to this growing collection of ideas?
Yeah, so speaking of mentor texts, I rely on them really heavily. I know Noni was talking about the importance of them. I have a book due at the end of this week, and next week, once my schedule is cleared, I'm planning on going and getting a little iced coffee and then going to my local library, and I'll be spending probably the entire day looking through picture books because I have several seeds of ideas that I know need to be picture books. I just don't yet know, they don't have a shape yet. And so that's how I'll be spending my time gearing up to write those. But I guess I'll talk a little bit about like how I decide or how I distinguish between what ideas are meant to be picture books versus middle grade or young adult. I like to think of all of these age categories And even within those age categories, different genres, different formats as various containers. And then it's my job to look at my ideas and figure out which container they fit in the best. So for me, picture books are obviously a much smaller container. So the story needs to be able to fit in that small space. And that's really why for me, like my guiding focus is always on childhood memories and specific images. So for A Crown for Corina, which was my first picture book, it's about a little girl who picks flowers from her abuela's garden to make a special flower crown for her birthday. And then each flower represents someone that she loves or some aspect of her personality, as well as her hopes and dreams for the future. And the scope of the picture book is basically just a single day in which Corina makes the crown, she has her birthday party, and then in the evening, she doesn't want to take the crown off in order to go to bed that night. So the plot, as well as her character arc, can all be contained in about 700 words. If the plot were more complex, if it was going to take more stages for her to reach, the end of that arc of her character development, it might not be able to fit in such a small container and therefore may need to be aged up to a chapter book or maybe even a middle grade novel. So I would just think about what can you accomplish with a small container versus a larger one. And if you can accomplish everything you want to with a smaller container, probably works as a picture book. And if you need a bigger container, it probably needs to be, a chapter book, middle grade, young adult novel. Luckily, I am not one of those writers who struggles with ideas. In fact, I have way too many of them. And so as they develop, one of the first questions I ask myself is what size does the container need to be?
I love that. Container size. I've never thought of it that way. I've had a similar issue. So my first book, Abuelo, The Sea and Me, it's a sort of a tribute to my own grandfather and my special relationship with him. And I initially started writing it thinking it was going to be a chapter book or like a middle grade book. And I think I got like a couple of chapters in and I was like, this isn't feeling right. Like it wasn't the message that I wanted to leave with. It was just kind of not flowing properly. So then I decided, let me try to write it like a poem. And that's what made me write it as a picture book. And that's when I was like, okay, this works as a picture book. Other things that I was thinking about as everybody was talking, I want to touch on, I've heard a lot of questions people ask, if you're writing a picture book, do you have to get the illustrator or do you have to like mock up illustrations? So the answer to that is if you have any illustrator or drawing talent, by all means, you can be an author illustrator. I have heard that agents are very fond of signing author illustrators. But if you have no artistic talent in that regard, have no fear, focus on your words. And usually what will happen is that the publisher will acquire the manuscript and then they will seek out an illustrator, sometimes with or without the consultation of the author. I was lucky. My publisher brought a couple of illustrators to me, 3 different illustrators. They said, what do you think about their styles? What do you think matches? And then we picked the one that matches. And what I think is so cool, and Noni mentioned this, is that when you have somebody who doesn't know you or doesn't know the story, all they know are the words that you've written. They don't know your own background to it. Then they take those words and they create another story on top of it. They layer another story with their illustrations, and it can be so beautiful. And I'll just show a quick page because Tatiana Gardel, this is her second picture book. She did such a wonderful job. So Abuelo, the Sea and Me takes place over multiple seasons at the beach, visits to the beach with the grandfather. And the little girl is seeing the grandfather open up over time about his life back in Cuba. And the little girl is having a growing awareness about maybe the sadness that the grandfather feels for having left his home behind. And there's this wonderful spread where Tatiana has a close-up of both the grandfather, the abuelo, and the little girl. And if you look really, really close, you can see that she has like a little she put a picture of a palm tree and like a little island in the abuelo's eyes. And in the little girl, her pupil is the grandfather. And I've never in 100 years would have thought to do something like this. But I think it's brilliant, and when I do visits with young children and I show them this, I say, what do you see here in Abuelo's eyes? And they say, oh, it's a palm tree. It's his island. That's his home. And what's in the little girl's eyes? Oh, that's Abuelo. So what do you think that means? And they really understand it just by looking at the image that, the Abuelo's thinking of his home and the little girl's watching him and thinking of Abuelo and thinking, oh my gosh, she's sad. So I think picture books are museums. They're magical. They're pieces of art. Somebody else was telling me that they like to have them as coffee table books. Like they put them on their coffee table for when they have guests and they're just waiting around that they can flip through their picture books. I'm like, that's great. Everybody should buy picture books to give away for Christmas gifts to all of their adult friends as well. But anything else that we haven't mentioned? I highly agree. The mentor text, I've gone to the library, I've come home with like stacks of picture books. I think that's always excellent. The other thing I would say is that's helpful, and this is true across the board, but I think especially with picture books, is if you can get, I found it very helpful to read and swap manuscripts with other people. And then the one other piece that Monica mentioned, so there's certain things that you don't want to include in your picture book manuscript that you don't want to include in your words, because that will be left to the illustrations. Like, for instance, you don't want to say, unless it's really pivotal to like, but you don't necessarily need to describe like the shirt that the character is wearing, because that is something that the illustrator can do, unless of course the story is about the shirt. But focusing on the action and with little hints of the emotion are what the words should be doing in the manuscript. Anything else about picture books?
One thing to note, picture books have a shape, and it's funny because it's a genre that has constrictions, right? As Lakin pointed out, it's a smaller container, and yet there's beauty in that. Just like in a song, there's a chorus, and I do think that I like the ideas of echoes in children's book, because I feel like when children, they build, and I've used that in my writing. It's also important to note that if it's nonfiction, it can start in a moment of crisis or in the middle of the action, and have the chronological story in between. It can be a circular story and a story within the story. So when you're planning, you have the creative idea, you can think about things, and they've all been mentioned, like the sound, the lyricism, the poetry. And then you can also think of the shape. Will it be sort of chronological or look like this? And you can think of the tense. I've written both biographies and picture book biographies, and fiction and nonfiction, both in first person with the I and then in third person, and they can be equally powerful. So just because it's small, because I think so many folks have ideas for picture books, pay attention to the genre conventions, because they can actually help you in making those decisions. When you think, okay, this is how many spreads. When I start to write, I brainstorm, I read, I research, sometimes I free write, but when I'm starting to work, I tend to like put my spreads out like page, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, just so I can see that shape myself.
That's excellent advice.
Sorry, I'm messing with my mute button, Ismay, as usual. Monica, I wanted to point something out that you said to me when I was going through the process of writing the picture book bio, because it was immense. And that's the case with any biography you're going to write. You're going to have hundreds and thousands of documents. And how are you making that into however many words? Probably just 500 to 800, and then your back matter. You said to me, define the door. What is the door into this story? And I had to write 3 different versions before I found the door. And I find that useful. Everything we're saying about Lakin saying the container, and you saying what's the shape, and bringing that together with the door. When it's something more familiar to you and you have a penchant for it, picture book fiction, I don't tend to have that issue of where's the door, but I did here, because it was out of my comfort zone. So I think all of this is great advice under all circumstances, but most especially when you're trying something that you're doing new. And I encourage people to do it because especially for our persons in the audience, our marginalized persons in the audience, we have not been encouraged to try new things and to experiment and to play in the same ways as other people have. And so I never would have thought, even years ago, that I would be making a picture book bio. So my point to you is keep open the idea and keep open the idea that you can do more than you expect is one. And two, don't be afraid to write 3 versions of the same story. That idea of playing with point of view. This story was written 3 different ways. It was a suitcase full of stories at first. And I thought the doorway was the suitcase, and it was not. And so do kind of think about, as you're creating drafts, it's not just perfecting every single line, and it is, but it's also finding the best format that's going to make it so that the story sings. It may kind of hum a little with one draft, but the next one you're like, there it is. Now it's really singing loudly.
I love that, making the story sing. All right, we do have a question from the audience. Can you share any mistakes or lessons learned when you started exploring a new age category? Lakin, would you like to field that one?
I mean, that first attempt is always me writing what I think is a picture book or what I think is a middle grade novel and working with whatever instincts I have at the time. And then once I have that first draft, that's where I think those quote unquote teachers come in, your agent, your editor, your critique partners, people who are experts in that particular age category, who can, along with your mentor text, help you hone in on what's working, what's not working, and just doing revisions until you get it right. I mean, when I wrote Omega Morales and the Legend of La Lechuza, which was my first middle grade novel, sold that to my editor at Little Brown. Again, that first attempt, I wrote what I thought was a middle grade novel, gave it my best effort, but I think really going through that revision process with my editor, who was an expert at what is a middle grade novel, she really taught me how to do it correctly. So I think if you're wanting to switch between genres, formats, age categories, you have to be really comfortable with doing it wrong the first time, which goes for any creative work, right? You've got to be unafraid of failure. You've got to see failure as a crucial part of the creative process. And if you're switching between these different formats, age categories, genres, you're just going to encounter it more because you're going to be a newbie more often than people who stick with the same, same type of story. So that would be my advice if you're wanting to try it out. Just get comfortable with doing it wrong, so that you can move on to doing it right.
I love that. And I think we had the first Latinx Kidlit Book Festival Storytellers Conference a few weeks ago, and I sat in as sort of not a moderator, but sort of like the room captain, making sure the speaker had water and such for one of the editors. And one of the main messages that the editor delivered was that as a writer, you have to get comfortable with critique. Like if you are going to be defensive and not listen and say, no, what I've written is perfect, then perhaps writing is not for you because it is an artistic process. And so that's perfect. You articulated it more eloquently than I just did, Lakin. But yes, there is the trial and error, and the getting feedback from all different levels, right? I mean, even reading it aloud to yourself, reading aloud to other children, getting feedback there's your critique group, there's your agent, there's your editor, all sorts of people who can give you advice and can help shape it. Monica or Noni, any other mistakes that you guys want to mention?
I think I can mention one that will lead us into another genre a little bit with chapter books and then hopefully middle grade and older too. And I'm going to do it in honor of Noni because she is the rebel, that I'm going to go against the grain because on the one hand, you do really need to be flexible and take critique. I mean, I feel like how I handle rejection is my superpower because I get it a lot, right? I let it I try to make it strengthen my belief in myself instead of stop, because how we respond to the hard things is what's going to make our lives, right? Because everyone's having fun when we're having fun. But with my first chapter book series, I thought, oh, I write children's books. I was full of creativity and energy. I was a lot younger, and it took me a year to write this first book. And just to throw some stuff out there, it's around 5,000 words, generally chapter books, 5,000 to 8,000. It can be anywhere from 5, 6 to 10 or 11 chapters, because I want to give some of that stuff too. But if you're going to write a series, you're committing. It's really intense, because you not only have to at least write the first one. My agent said, well, you're an established picture book author. If you write one and have some synopses for like 4 different books or 3, we could probably sell that. Sometimes you have to write the first 2 books. It depends where you are, and established. And you kind of are world building, because there's more characters. Unlike a picture book, there's a plot, but also a subplot, because you're sustaining. And there's fewer publishers. I feel like since this book, there's more that are doing chapter books, but there's fewer publishers then. Another thing is that for a lot of series now, I've noticed, and 2 of mine they're IP, which means you don't get to own your intellectual property, or people bring a germ of an idea or a big idea, and then that's how a lot of publishers are doing it. With Lola, everything was my beginning and end. It took a long time to write that first book, and secondly, it got rejected, and I made a mistake of listening when they said, "What if we don't think kids will read soccer books? Can you give her a different thing that she loves to do? Because she's a major soccer girl." And then they said, how about if she had a superpower? And I tried to please the editors. And then I realized, how about she's just an amazing girl who doesn't fit into gender norms, and who has a loud voice and is strong and is an athlete and comes from this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious family. And I sort of stuck to my core belief in it, which is the opposite of advice we get. And it turned out to be one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. So I think, yes, we have to listen and learn from others, but also know when to sort of honor the core of what we feel our writing's about. And because series are such it's like both a marathon and a race, I think we should keep that in mind too.
No, that's perfect, because it is a delicate balance, because we're saying you have to be able to handle rejection. You're going to have to be able to handle the suggestions, the editorial suggestions and critiques that you're going to get, but you're also going to have to know when it's okay and when you should, defend your own voice, your own story, because ultimately it's your name on the book. Everybody's going to associate that story with you, not necessarily your editor. A lot of people don't even know who the editor is. And so that is something that especially I'm still grappling with, even though I've published a handful of books, but especially as a young writer, it can be a challenge. But I think asking for help, because I know I had some issues with my second young adult where some suggestions were made that I didn't feel comfortable with. And I ended up asking a bunch of writer friends, this is what's going on. What do you guys think? What should I do? And I got some very helpful advice. And then I went to my agent, and my agent helped make a nice, polite communication to the editor, thank you for this, but we would prefer if it stays, this way. All right, questions are coming in. This is fantastic. We have an
I'm
active
going to jump
audience.
in right there, Ismay, because that was a beautiful segue. Monica and Lakin and Ismay, I'm glad you went first, because I want everybody out there to have a critique group and support. But I do want to mention some of that support is emotional. Publishing is extremely rigorous. It can be unbelievably difficult. So as much as I'm out here in the front saying I'm going to write what I'm going to write, how I want to write it, yes, after edits and all that, but you need your people to talk to in that process. And that's not just mentorship. That's why groups like Las Musas exist. This is a journey, and one success doesn't mean, no matter if you have the highest success, which to me is still the Pura Belpré, that thing, okay, but you still have to deal with the publishing industry and all of the difficulties of marketing yourself constantly. So I would say to everyone hearing your journey, make sure you have your friends close, your people close, your creative partners close. That's one. And the second thing is, again, the fact that there are many instances where stories from our marginalized communities are not considered as marketable as others. There are times when they are, and I'm hearing a ton of them right now, of course, but I can speak to as someone who's an experimental writer, that's not always the case. And sometimes you have to fight for your story, your voice, and what you want to put out there in the world. You can talk to your friends for personal therapy, as I do, and then you persevere and you write your stories anyway. And I say that because, to segue to YA, the Discern Girls Dictionary would not exist if I had listened to everybody, period. End of story. And I have to tell you, some of those people are not published. You know, yes, it needed edits. Yes, needed people to work with me, but to work to actualize, I love that word, to actualize and make the best out of what you are creating, not to change it into what it isn't meant to be to begin with, or to make it more palatable sometimes. So I think we have to always keep in mind we're making a balance, right? We're making a balance of, yes, you need feedback. I already told you I've worked with Monica, and I will continue to do that. And again, I'm going to give you a funny example of a big mistake in a second. But I want to have you all strike that balance. You know when to fight for your work, but also fight for yourself and say, is this good enough? Is this good enough? We have to ask those questions, right? Is this strong enough? Once it's out of my hands and I can't touch it or fix it anymore, am I going to, no matter what anybody says, be proud of this and be proud of the fact, as Ismay brought up at the beginning, that children are going to have this, that this is going to be in the minds and hearts of children. And yes, there are adults who read our work, but as you were saying at the beginning, our ultimate responsibility is for the young people, especially the young people who are dealing with books being taken away from them right now. And I'll pivot to the mistake question. The containers and the shape are very important. I shared with Monica a fiction picture book that was 2,000 words. And, you know, I should have known better, but I was so passionate. The idea was this kid was going to rescue the plants. Their father had passed away. He had a garden, and the kid was going to rescue all these plants. And I thought this was going to fit into a picture book. And Monica's like, listen, I need to speak with you. She's very direct. She's like, I need to... I'm sorry, I'm laughing because she really, really is lovely and sweet, but she's also direct. She's like, this is not going to work. This is at least probably a middle grade book. Okay, that's moving on to the next conversation. And she's correct.
I could have been wrong, Noni. So
you are not wrong, because that is what is morphed into the middle grade that I'm working for Versify right now. So no, you were not wrong. And I will point out that the middle grade is the area of most discomfort for me. I can tell you that right now. I need the most guidance there with how I proceed, because I'm used to the extreme of YA. Picture books are more tender. The same kind of topics can be covered in all three, right? But there's a tenderness when you're dealing with the younger kids. With the older kids, you have to give them some hope, but you can be a little bit more direct. So I think anything that you consider, I'll conclude with this, a mistake, whether it's this wasn't what I thought it was going to be, or this isn't going to get published now. Maybe it'll get published later. I've got a book now from 15 years ago, I just counted, that's now going out. I'm like, you know, don't think every single thing has to be published the immediate second that you write it, is the other thing. And last, there's no mistakes to my mind, because everything that you write, whether it sells right now or later, may be evolving, marinating, needs to mature. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be something for the future. So leave it at that.
Well, and you also learn from it. It's a writing exercise for you. You know, like with every creative process, a mistake is just part of the process, right? So I just wanted to bounce back to one thing that you said, Noni, at the beginning about the importance of having a community supporting you, and mention for those in the audience who might not know, Las Musas is a collection of Latinx authors who have come together to support one another. But there are lots of other ways that you can find community in writing, like SCBWI, who's sponsoring this panel for us. I found my first critique group through SCBWI because I live in the New York area, and and my group was in New Jersey, and so then I just like went over the bridge and I met with people and we swapped manuscripts, and it's a great way to get started and to get good feedback, and also to get that moral support that Noni was saying. So one of the questions, Noni, you already answered it, but I'm gonna say the question and then we'll punt it to Monica and Lakin. So, which age category do you find the trickiest to write for? Oh, but this was specifically in terms of gatekeepers and schools. So, Noni, you mentioned middle grade is tough. Do you want to qualify that in terms of the gatekeeper school issue?
I, I know that everyone will have their own take. I would say there is no book that's easier to get in. Picture books are being banned. It's the topic. And you'd think the most innocuous books, which are just about us all loving each other and being kind and, this is terrible. How could we be so brave as to love one another? I would suggest to you, and I know Lakin's going to take this, and Monica, my whole comment is go to conferences not just to meet editors and agents. We need that for sure. We're excited about that hustle. Go there to meet educators, because these are the people who are going to get your books in there. And to begin with, my first book, one of the best contacts I made were other educators who said, here, I would like you to come to my school. And they're bringing my books. And if you can tell, my books do have issues that I have had books banned, So I don't think it's so much. I assume I've had my books door to door by politicians. It's difficult. So reach out to your educators and make them as part of your network. You support them, they support you, and you are much more likely to get whatever books that you're making into classrooms, even in areas like Texas, which I have my books going into those classrooms. So it's more about, to me, relationship building, because this climate is very difficult. And I'll just pass the torch.
So, Lakin, I want to hear from you. Answer the question, what do you personally find the easiest to write? And then answer specifically in terms of your experience with gatekeepers.
Okay, yeah, I think it's easier to separate the two. To be honest, in terms of what's easier to write, it really doesn't matter like what genre, format, age category. What matters is like my state of mental health at that moment, and how I'm doing. And if I'm not doing well, I'm gonna struggle with whatever that creative project is. And if I am doing well, then things are gonna flow. So that doesn't really matter. They can all be hard. I can find a state of flow in all of them. It just depends. In terms of gatekeepers in schools, school visits used to be a really big part of my income. And now I am lucky if I get 1 or 2 visits a year. And again, I'm here in Central Texas. I do live in Austin, which is a more progressive city. I think, at least in Austin ISD, they are having less issues than maybe the surrounding counties. But it's still an issue. And I think a lot of educators and a lot of librarians are just preemptively deciding not to bring up the topic of bringing in authors or bring up the topic of doing like a one school, one read type of thing, because they just don't want the headache. And I totally empathize with that. And I think it's going to take more than just those educators to find a solution. I think we as a society have to figure out how to deal with this problem. Just from a logistical standpoint, in terms of like age categories, like which ones are the trickiest for schools, I will say that, and I think this was true even before, book banning really took off. It was always harder for me to get school visits at the high school level. And I think that's because, just remembering my time as a teacher, those administrators do not want to give up a second of instructional time. They care so much about testing that they really don't want to bring in any kind of programming that's going to take students out of core classes where they're going to be missing that instruction. So, obviously I love writing YA and I will always write YA, but I never really built a lot of school visit programs around my YA novels just because I knew those weren't going to translate into school visits. School visits, I think, are much easier to get with picture book and middle grade. And to me, that's an indication that those books are being used more by educators than educators that are in high school.
I 100% agree. Yeah. So if your goal is to do a lot of school visits, I would focus on the middle grade and the picture book, because it's true. The high schoolers, they just don't have time in their schedule. And, we see this in the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival too. It's harder. Like our sweet spot is like that middle school range. A lot of middle school classrooms tune in. The younger kids love to have read alouds too, though. So that's really nice. Monica, what are the trickier areas that you have found or any issues with gatekeepers that you want to comment on?
All these questions we could have an hour discussion on. First, I want to just say thanks to Lakin for acknowledging that our how we and Noni too, how we care for our hearts and our minds affect how we write. And I guess I'll take it further. I think there's a myth that writing for children is easier somehow. It's all hard if you, and it may not, like sometimes, yes, the muse is happening. There's this sort of joy and flow for me. But very often, depending on, I have a chronic illness, I manage my other job as a teacher, I have kids, the world has some very painful things happening. For that reason, I have to write in the morning because my best writing happens before I've looked at the news, before I have let the day weigh upon my mind. Because, I think a lot of creative people are anxious, and I'm certainly one of them. So I try to open my day and when I'm going to write and create with refreshed, not exhausted, and to just sit in that place because I don't think you have to. I think for me, I need to write for children from a place of joy and hope, which is kind of what we're saying. Um, so that's one thing. I'm really glad you mentioned Laking because getting support helps. Because I think there's a myth. Well, I do think that people who are creative can imagine the good and the bad, right? So it can be really, really challenging. But the sad truth is that the creativity and the spark in the writing is maybe a quarter of what we do if we want to be published professional writers that are earning a living from this, and that we can there's nothing wrong with self-publishing but if we want our books to go into the hands of many, many children, there's so much marketing and negotiating and planning and promoting that it's pretty exhausting. So, and I think so that's its own gatekeeper. If you can do more than be creative and be also a business person, take care of your mental health, take care of your physical health, your lower back pain, your carpal tunnel, and then traveling. I used to do tons of school visits, which I actually think helped me have as long lasting of a career as I have had, because once your books find their way into like that first kindergarten class, that first grade class, they have little sisters and little siblings, and then it becomes favorites of teachers and things like that. So I think there are gatekeepers. That's one thing. In terms of outside writing is tricky, and at different moments, different pieces are tricky. It depends where we're at in so many ways. But I do think you should try to be writing what gives you some pleasure if you're going to do all the rest of it, which is really hard. In terms of gatekeepers, that's just a struggle. It was so hard to publish my first book about a mixed race protagonist. There was very few, especially when what few there were Black and white mixed race protagonists, but to write about Latinidad and Latinos and intermarriage and different intermarrying and religious was actually pretty radical when we started trying to find a publisher. But now that isn't necessarily the case the way it was. There's other gatekeepers. Like for what has bothered me is if there's one book on a Latino figure, that's it. We can have like 10 books about George Washington or whomever, but once the one, it's kind of a tokenism. But you can even try to like overcome that, like I remember, well, I think I've spoken enough on that. I want to hear from other folks. So great questions. These are all panels for next year, I guess.
I know. So one thing I remember hearing, because when I started going to SCBWI conferences as, like an aspiring writer, I remember somebody saying everybody has this internal age that they have that they think that they're kind of stuck at, and that's where they write. And so I started writing young adult. I sort of gravitated towards that because I felt like my inner voice was like a 16-year-old girl. But I mean, we've all broken the mold. We've written across different age groups. So I just wanted to ask you guys, what do you say to that? Is there still is there still an area that you feel most comfortable in, or is it really just about being a storyteller and learning how to best tell the story? Noni, you go first.
Again, your these questions can take. It's funny you say that, because like all my YA characters are 15, all of them. And it is very intentional, and only some people pick up on it, because I like that tender spot when they're over freshman year, but still in that very in-between space, where there's so much weighing upon them coming in the future about being an adult. They may be in situations where they have to be adult. Maybe they're taking care of their parents' mental health. That often can be a topic that I address, but they're still kids. And so one thing that I like to explore, especially in Latinidad, where so many of us were, elder sisters parenting, taking on adult roles in many different respects, is that they get to still be kids. And as much as they may be dealing with sex, sexuality, gender, conflict, the future, they still have room to be absurd and silly, just like every other white protagonist, and have adventures and that kind of thing. So I would say that reason why I focus on that age is because I want to give the readers acknowledgement and validation, of course, but also permission. Like, yes, you have the right to not always be serious and responsible for other people every second of the day, and just to be the kid. So I guess to answer the question about sweet spots, I think that guides me more, this desire to impart that to readers, than any age category. I desire to use my writing as a platform to give kids mantras when they need them, to give them the things that adults should be saying to them that sometimes aren't. The truth is, it's about homeless LGBTQ plus youth, and it's so underwritten. And if I had them right in front of me, and I have in cases, what do I want to say? And if I can't be in front of them, what do I want to send to them? So think those little rafts of light, to me, bring together all those age categories of what I'm trying to do, more so than I think of, oh, it's an age category or it's a particular genre. And I know everyone will have a different approach, but I think if you think about what are you doing this for me, with so much suppression, it's always been, what can I say to the kid that I can't meet but I know is out there, and I want to whisper into their ear,
I love that. Lakin, how about you? How do you approach it? Is it all container, or is it?
Yeah, so I've heard a version of that quote that you mentioned, but I've heard it in the mental health space, that at whatever age you experienced, the most trauma, there is a part of you that stays that age forever. And I've always talked about that in relation, in particular to my young adult novels, because I do feel like my teenage years were really, really difficult, and I experienced some very difficult things. And there's a part of me that is that age forever. I think because of those experiences. And so writing for me, I think it does initially start out as a very self-serving endeavor. There's a question that I'm trying to answer. There's an experience that I'm trying to process, something that I'm trying to heal usually. And so I'm also thinking about that when I'm thinking about the container, especially when I'm thinking about whatever it is that I need in relation to theme. Like if those themes that I want to explore stem from some kind of personal experience or personal need to heal something very specific from my own childhood or adolescence, I'll think about how old was I when I was dealing with those things. And then also, sometimes there are questions that we have as an adult that I think, like we've been talking about, or we talked about earlier, how a lot of these things you can explore in any of these different age categories, but do I want to approach it with that tenderness that Noni was talking about that we associate with picture books? Do I want to approach it with more, straightforwardness that we might do in YA? Do I want to approach it with, a bitter sweetness and be able to talk more about the gray? Like, just how am I wanting to present this is also something that I think about. But Yeah, I think about a lot of those things when I'm thinking about what age category an idea belongs in. But I think ultimately what drives my final decisions is just what I need from this particular exploration.
Annika, is there anything you'd like to add?
It's funny. I think because I had a edgy kind of adolescence, and I use that ironically, is why I cannot write edgy YA. I think for me, it's protective to want to be in the very young age group, because that's a place I can have sort of less complicated joy and imagination. And it might be a flaw. Like I find I have a lot to write. The amazing Denise Chavez once told me, but if you write from the pain, that's what I want you to write from. And I'm like, I cannot. I need to write from the playfulness and the imagination at a time before certain types of pain. And so, like, I wrote The Turquoise Room, El Cuarto Turquesa, in honor of my mother and her mother, who had a turquoise room in Piura, Peru. And it's autobiographical, very much so. Like, there's characters named Esther, Isabel, Maria, and my own daughters. It's about magic woman who can fly. But I had to do it in picture book form. And I realized, here's a mistake. My editor asked, because I had inherited a chronic illness from my mother, who passed super young, and her mother passed at 41, after 9 children, 7 of which survived in Peru. I couldn't even write about that in it. It just had to be in that realm of the magical and the hopeful. And so I don't know. I guess we're always growing. So maybe I'll find, like, the courage, the way some of my colleagues have had to write those stories that are a little more painful. And I do tackle hard topics, but it's usually with humor and a certain sort of protective family, like the one I tried to create for my daughters, in my picture books and chapter books.
I love that. I will say, I'll put out there, so as the audience has heard, there's no one right way to do anything. We all have our own different ways. And I would have to argue that also, my approach to each one of my books has been slightly different, right? Because there's, you as an individual change over time. As an artist, you change over time. There are certain themes that are more like clearly fitting a certain age group. Like if you want to write a story about the first day of kindergarten, that's likely going to be a picture book. You want to think of the age of your main character and that moment in the life of the main character that you're trying to capture. If you want to write a story about a girl getting her period for the first time, that's likely going to be a middle grade book, because that is the age range when that happens. And if you're going to write about first love, it could be upper middle grade. More likely it's going to be young adult, but not necessarily. So those sort of the topics or the themes that you want to include might actually decide that for you, what age group you end up writing it for. Of course, there are transcendental themes, like a love between a grandparent and a grandchild, that you can write about in any of those age categories. Okay, we have only 20 minutes left, which means we have less than 20 minutes. Okay, so let's talk about a few craft points. So Lakin, I'm going to ask you to give a couple of craft pearls for middle grade. Then we'll move quickly on to give some craft pearls for young adult. And then so this is going to be more like fast speed dating. And then we're going to go and talk about the difference in marketing between all of these types of age categories.
Advice that is specific to middle grade.
Anything that you have found that is uniquely middle grade. And if it's not, you can say, actually, this is important for all of it. And that it's this fallacy that in middle grade, you have to do it this way, and you can't do that in young adult, and you can't do that in picture book.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like any prescriptive advice that I could give for each category. I think again, like we've talked about, like who is telling the story, and while the age of that person is important, it's not the only contributing factor to their point of view. Like there are other things to consider, right? Like where do they live? What is their family structure? Like, are they an introvert or an extrovert? Are they neurodivergent? Are they able-bodied? Like what's their gender identity? What are they afraid of? What do they want most in the world? Like those things I think play more of a role in how I construct a character and a narrative than just their age. So I think figuring out character can often help determine the audience, and then audience of course determines the age category, and then you can go from there. But like we've all kind of repeated several times, there's so much that you can do in terms of theme, in terms of craft, in across all of these different age categories. It just depends on, you know, the story that's in front of you and how you want to approach it and how you want to talk about it and how you want the reader to receive it.
Mhm. So is it true that middle grade books should not have swear words in it?
That's not
I've heard
true
people
anymore. I just read Manny Samia Finds Her Quetzal Voice, which is the funniest middle grade novel I've ever read. And it had some cursing in Spanish. And I guess it would be considered an upper middle grade. So I think, yeah, it depends on the editor that you're working with and the publisher and what they're okay with. I mean, if we're being honest, you know, especially as a former teacher, like middle schoolers curse. And so I guess as an author, you just have to think about how you want to present that truth in a middle grade novel, and you know, whether it's sort of whether you're neutral about it or whether you condone it or whatever. But like I think that, you know, I have at least one example of a book that I've read where it existed just as it does in real life.
Well, and I would go back to what you said, because I loved that about the importance of the character, right? So you have to decide who is the character that I'm creating, and would that be something that character would do? And if it is, then yeah, they should probably curse. And if it's not, if that's not the way that the character would talk, then they don't talk that way. Noni, do you want to give some salient pointers about young adult?
If I can unmute. I'm technologically a genius. I think I'm going to not follow directions like I always do and give two pieces of advice. Okay, so I'm not going to do YA first. I'm going to do chapter books. So there. I'm working as a New York Public Library diversity consultant right now, which can bring up all sorts of questions from the group. But here's what I know from talking to editors, publishers, organizations all over this country, and what we need. And one of the biggest dirts that we have are early childhood books, board books, and I'm talking about diverse board books. I'm talking about own voices. We need not just Caps for Sale and the Very Freaking Hungry Caterpillar, bless them, but we need other things. We need translations from the original, starting off with that language and not just a book that was always in English and is now being made into Spanish. And also, we need chapter books and series, own voices, BIPOC and LGBTQ, so that kids can take a bunch of beautiful skinny books off the shelf and say, I read 10 of them like we used to do. I read the entire Goosebumps. I read whatever it was, The Magic Treehouse. So I want to say kind of that for those of you out there who want to try that. We don't have enough at all. And I'm speaking on behalf of a huge entity here. So that's one. As far as pivoting to YA, you have to keep it real. The kids that you're writing for, they are going through it. And even if this kid, put them in an upper middle class, suburban, whatever you think is going to make life, they are going through it. They are stressed out. They know all about climate change and they are terrified. They are actually making decisions about whether to have kids. I've heard them now based on that. They are kind. They don't see things the way us Gen X people do at all. They are much kinder as far as understanding human beings have more than one gender. And there's nothing you're going to do to take that out of them because they're kind. We won that lesson, educators. We are making loving, kind people, and doesn't matter what you take away. So we have to address the fact that they are all freaking stressed out. And not only do we have these mental health problems, but they have them. There's not enough mental health professionals to go around. You've got schools with not enough counselors. So when you're writing for them, keep all that in mind and think about what you're leaving them with, no matter how much trauma you put your protagonist through. What do you leave that very stressed out kid with at the end is what I would say is my piece of advice.
I love that. At some point, somebody was asking me, like, why aren't you just writing for adults? Like, why? I think these are my like pediatric cardiology, like physician colleagues. Like, why did you write your first novel as a young adult? Why wasn't it an adult? And I was like, well, I also, besides the things that we've touched on, like where I had a character and the character was this age and going through this stuff at this time, I like the hopefulness of writing for young adult. I feel like, and that's why I personally love to read young adult, because in general, I find that as a genre, young adult tends to be more hopeful than a lot of the adult books that I read that tend to deal with more of the sort of the jaded characters, like life isn't good anymore and it never has been and it never will. Whereas a lot of the young adult is, even if bad things happen, they're young. They can still change. They can still learn lessons and hold on to that hope. So I totally agree with that. That we need a lot of. I love the stories with hope. I'll throw my 2 cents in the ring about young adult. You've probably heard that editors like voices that are very voicey, right? Like, so I think that gets to the authenticity of the voice of the young person. Some people can write that and some people can't. So be very careful. Young adult tends to be in first person point of view. I felt this, I felt that, so that you're very close, but it doesn't have to be. I think that's like the only other things that I wanted to add based on my own hearing all of the bits of advice from all the other writing conferences that I've been to. All right, let's quickly go to so Monica, do you use the same agent for all your different types of books? Can your agent rep all of these different types of categories? Do you need different agents?
My agent reps my chapter books and my picture books. When I have been approached, as Noni mentioned, by textbook writers to do something special for that, she wouldn't be representing that because it's educational writing, and obviously I'm a published scholar too, and so that's completely independent. But yeah, I think that's a choice you make when you choose an agent. Some people have different agents for different things, but mine just represents my children's books.
Anybody here on this panel have different agents for different types of books?
I do. But Lakin, do you have anything to add before I get in there? Because I definitely want to hear your lovely voice.
No, I have an agent that reps everything I write and everything I could want to write. So yeah, so I'd love to hear about your experience having multiple agents.
I think this came from the challenge of sometimes you may choose an agent that isn't your best fit, and breakups happen. I will put that. And when that happened, my amazing agency addressed some of that by having me have more than one agent to represent. So I have someone for YA and I have someone for the picture books, but they're a team. So I guess my advice there would be, you're obviously hearing variation. Whomever you're choosing is your champion. They're going out there to fight for you in teams where they're finding every reason not to publish whatever it is, when you're going through acquisitions. And so I know now that those persons are out there and they're swinging hard, right? And you need to make sure, how do you know that? You have those conversations and you also are present for them. I was present for some of those conversations and now I'm thrilled with what I hear, and in the past was not. So I would suggest that we're all thrilled about first publications and editors or agents being interested in us, but just to consider, maybe it's the first agent, but maybe it's not. Who is going to be the person who's in love and is going to tirelessly put your work out there.
Yeah, and I guess when I think about it, like it's a business, as I've mentioned, and it's complex. So like my agency has a partnership with a foreign rights agent, and so I have my books in like a dozen languages now. That's a question to ask your agent. When I was approached and that was a big rejection. It was optioned. My Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match series. It even, for a children's cartoon, it even got developed into a pilot with like some amazing Latino actors. And then it didn't get chosen, but because they approached me and my agent directly, we decided instead of working with a TV agent that we would consult a lawyer, a TV lawyer, and just in terms of the initial options and contracts, and then not get another right agent. So that stuff is complex. And then maybe there's a situation where you want to, like I partnered with a company that does textile things in Peru, and my agent decided like that was something that I decided to do that she didn't represent me on, which is very rare, but it was a very distinct thing. So it might seem like these are yes or no answers, but really the business part of it is very complex, and there's no one exact answer at all times. That's why these groups like this festival is so important, because there's so much knowledge out here. Las Musas, Latinx in Publishing, SCBWI. If you get good mentors there's so many different groups, and we need to be educated. And that's why, like, I've seen like an explosion of new writers and voices that are just each more talented and creative than the next. And it's because of this sort of group support and education.
Okay, how about, I love all that. I'm like, oh my gosh, we have only like 5 minutes left. How about editors? Does anybody have the same editor editing their picture book and their other age group? I personally do not. I've had different editors for my different age groups.
I have the same house. Like I have chapter book series for coming out from Harper Kids and picture books, and the same with Little Brown. I have for Little Brown my same editor of Doña Fela is the same. Nikki Garcia, who's amazing, is the same as Lola Levine, but it's not usual.
I have 6 or 7 editors at this point. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned post my debut year was really to be loyal to no one but myself. And writing across age categories, I think, is one of the ways that it feels almost protective almost to have all of these different publishing partners that I can essentially try out. And if I don't like the way that they've treated me or treated my work, I can just go somewhere else and find a new publishing partner. Also, just strategically, I have publishers, for example, with picture books, I have publishers who take my picture books that are a little bit more lyrical, more poetic. I have other publishers who take things that are a little bit more character driven or plot focused. And the great thing about picture books is that you can publish, multiple year, as long as, depending on your contract, as long as they're all in different seasons. And so financially, it's also to my benefit to be able to publish across age categories and formats with these different publishing partners. So I would say to people watching, like, I think a lot of people have this notion that it's like this amazing thing to be a house author. And I think if a publisher treats you like a house author and pays you a living wage and you can afford to work for just them, then that's great. But most of us don't find ourselves in that situation. And so it's perfectly acceptable and probably in your best interest to work with a lot of different people and find the right fit and just, sell as many books as you can.
And just a clarification for the audience, I think the reason is that if you are publishing a book with a specific publisher, let's say it's in September, they will probably only want you they will only be marketing you for that one book for that season. They are not going to be able to market you for a picture book and a young adult in the exact same season, because that will be splitting, their forces. But as Lakin mentioned, you could do that with different publishers, because then they would each have their own task to market you. And so, Noni, here's a question about marketing. Can you tell us what are the things that you need to keep in mind, young adult versus picture book, when it comes to marketing? Because we all know that writers now have to do a lot of the marketing ourselves.
That's true. I do want to caution against burnout. I think you have to make a plan of 5 to 7 things for the year, and that's it. And you have to find the most effective things for you. If you are an excellent social media presence and you're going to do book talk and you're going to rock that, put your power into that. If you're more introverted, that's me, then that's not going to work for me. So I'm going to mingle with people at conferences. I'm going to meet with educators. I'm going to mark myself on my website, which does matter. I can see how many people are on my website and soliciting me and trying to contact me for programming. You can make a menu on your website of products and services that you offer. For example, you're going to do workshops and you're like, that's me, I can teach. We have a lot of educators in the room. Put your menu on your website where it's easily accessible, that doesn't cost anything. Make sure that you have a budget that's reasonable for you. Lakin was talking about, we do not all make hundreds of thousands of dollars. Many of us have more than one job, right? And many of us are using supplemental things, whether that's more than one publisher, whether that's in addition, I need to do school visits. You have to consider yourself for marketing as in, how can I support myself? Where can I apportion my time for marketing? I think time is as much as important as deciding what you're doing. How much time a week am I going to do this? What is my budget? Stick to it. Is it worth it doing a pre-order campaign? Sometimes it is, and sometimes I've done absolutely nothing. And the same result has happened and I've spent nothing. And other times it's mattered. So anyway, as we go to the end here, just make sure that you do not think that what Monica does or Lakin does or what I do is going to be a perfect fit for you. Find that mentor text person and say, that person is marketing the way I can do that well, and follow their lead.
Thank you. So we don't all have to be on social media, is what you're saying. Some people do it really well, and for some of us, it can be more challenging. The one thing that I will also say is that, I know we have 2 minutes left. Keep in mind who is buying your books. If it's a picture book, obviously the little kids aren't the ones buying your book, so you cannot market directly to those little kids. You will be marketing to the parents and the educators and the librarians. If it's a young adult, you can market directly to your readers. And so I've heard it say that if you want to make it big in young adult, you have to be on TikTok. You have to sort of connect directly with the teens. I think that's certainly one way to be very successful. But not as necessary in a picture book, unless you want to do book talk and be targeting your librarians and your educators. Monica, do you have anything to add about Oh, go ahead.
Book talkers, I want to add this. Sometimes you're excellent at it, but other times, like for They Thought They Buried Us, I had book talkers do it for me. They got to choose my book and put that out there. So if you're trying to market, Colored Pages will assist you if you are perhaps not as extroverted and you want passionate people reading and doing that advertising for you. I love people who are out there, but that's just not everybody. Some of us are a little bit more reserved, and we still need to sell the books.
Yeah, I think we have 1 minute left. Last thoughts. Monica, you go, and then Lakin.
I'll turn it over to Lakin. I feel like I've talked a lot.
Oh, I was just going to say that we should probably also mention, since this is the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival, just to keep it real, like we've been doing, publishers don't really know how to market to our target audiences. Mm-hmm. And right now, they don't have a lot of motivation to learn. So one thing you're going to find if you are a marginalized author writing for marginalized communities, you're going to have to do a lot of that bridge building for your publisher, because they just are not willing to make the effort right now to market directly to marginalized communities and marginalized readers. But maybe someone say something else so we don't have to leave it on.
No, I know. I will say that they are very interested in learning. The Latinx Kidlit Book Festival has been has benefited greatly from the sponsorship of a lot of the large publishers. And so there's a lot of interest, but I agree that there's a learning process that is currently happening. And I think they're looking at us to figure out how to do that better. And Lakin, you're amazing. Everybody should use Lakin as like a mentor person for how to market, because you've had some wonderful marketing campaigns for your books. But unfortunately, we are out of time. So I want to give a huge thanks to our audience and anybody who's going to tune in. And thank you to my wonderful panelists, Monica, Lakin, and Noni. And thank you to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival and SCBWI for sponsoring us. Good luck to everybody out there. Write what, the same with marketing. You need to write what feeds you, what makes you feel good, what makes you sing, what keeps you up at night thinking about these characters. And you have to handle marketing the same way. Don't do it unless it's authentic to you, unless it makes you feel good.
And remember, it is ultimately
Thanks, guys.
all about your stories. So just
wait, Monica, you're muted. Say it again.
Oh, I just wanted to say, remember, it does come to the fact of the story. Tell good stories. That's the most basic thing that we do, and that's the first step. So focus on that before you try to solve all the other problems in the profession.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you again, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.